Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a review of Shogun by James Clavell. This is a historical fiction epic that tells the story of an English pilot whose ship ends up in Japan. We're basically charting his journey as he enters into a foreign culture. He meets interesting people, some of whom are on their own quest for power. It's about a man who is torn between what he knows and what he has come to learn. It's a book that I've been wanting to read for decades. Like, my mum loved this book. She read this book when she was a teenager and she loved it. And I've had it on my bookshelves for probably about 7, 8, 9 years. I've just had it forever. But it's a chunky book, you know, it's over 1,000 pages. I think my copy was like 1,300 pages and the font is quite small. So I was waiting for the right moment to read it. I decided to pick it up over Christmas and it came into the new year as well. It took me about 2 weeks to read. I decided to read it because the Shogun TV show is coming out in February and my review may or may not be up by then. But I wanted to read the first book before that came out so that I could compare the two, and I will probably do a comparison video once the show is out. But when that show got announced many years ago, I said to myself, I have to read the book before I watch it. And I know this show is going to be amazing because it has like some of the best Japanese actors in it. And I just can't wait. I'm so excited. So I thought, okay, I've got like 2 months to read it. And I just thought over Christmas, you know what, let's read a good historical epic because I do love a good epic now and then. So let's jump into my normal review style. I'll talk about what I liked and then also about issues that I had with the book. I'm not going to talk about spoilers or anything like that, so don't worry. And without further ado, let's jump in. So in terms of what I liked, I really liked seeing our main character, John Blackthorne, go through a journey of being this very judgmental, elitist, know-it-all, to then being very humbled and very open to exploring a very different way of life. Now, John Blackthorne is British, he is English, and he has very strong opinions about the world, and his opinions are formed by British imperialism and colonialism. There is this very negative attitude towards other cultures, and so seeing him go from that very arrogant, you know, my way or the highway kind of approach to, by the end of the book, where he's a little bit more open and he's a little bit more tolerant, it's always something that I really enjoy watching. Some of my favourite books have that as a trope or as a mechanism. And one film that I really enjoyed, The Last Samurai, also has that. You know, it's based on an American soldier, ends up in Japan, has very kind of backwards views on Japanese culture, but then by the end of it, he actually accepts their way of living and embraces it to some extent. And we see that with John here, and I quite enjoyed it. I do love seeing the kind of stuck-up British man or English man kind of get put in his place. Like, I love to see it, I'm here for it. And I think it's just a nice way of going through this journey with John, especially if you don't know a lot about Japanese culture and history. Like, I think it's a good way to experience that for the first time through the eyes of someone who is also experiencing it for the first time. I think particularly for somebody who doesn't know tons about Japanese culture, this is actually quite a great way to ease yourself into it by experiencing it live with him. The other thing that I thought was done pretty well was the writing and the pacing. The way he writes doesn't distract from the story, and ultimately for this type of historical epic, that's what you want. And I think, you know, this book is trying to achieve a lot. It's a very long book and it's, you know, it's a book with magnitude in the sense that it's trying to cover a lot of different things. And his writing doesn't detract from that. His pacing is also pretty good. You know, this is an epic through and through. It's split into 6 sections. You could read those maybe once a month if you wanted to enjoy a bit slowly, but it does need the time for us to get a really good sense of the setting, of the characters, of what is happening on a broader macro scale. I think it's good and I think it suits this type of story. Let's go into characters now. Characters, as we all know, are my favourite part, and this, I would say, as much as it is a historical epic, it's also very much a character study. A lot of people say it's quite historically accurate. I'm not going to endorse that notion because I'm not experienced enough to say whether it is or it isn't, and I will come on to that a little bit later on, but some of these characters are actually based on real life historical figures, people who actually lived and breathed and, you know, have played pivotal roles in, you know, Japanese and to some extent English history. There are a lot of characters in this book and I think they all feel quite distinct, and I think there's a really great secondary and tertiary cast of characters, but the ones that I'm going to talk about are the ones that were most notable for me. So firstly, we have John Blackthorne, who was based on a real man who went by the name of William Adams. And he is our, you know, our captain, our very British captain, our very English captain, who has a real sense of pride for his country and for what his country has achieved and will achieve. Like I said, I'm not going to talk too much about John because I've already said that I do like seeing him go through this journey of being very close-minded and quite backwards to actually being very open-minded and accepting of things that he previously didn't have knowledge of. I love witnessing that journey that he went through. My favourite character, I have two favourite characters in this book, and they are both Japanese characters. So the first one was Mariko. So Mariko, I'm not going to say who she is because I don't want to accidentally spoil it, but when you come across her, and you come across her pretty quickly, she's just an amazing character. I think she's the depiction of strength, but like different types of strength, not necessarily physical strength, but like mental and intellectual strength and emotional strength. She's just a character that I loved reading about and that I would happily read a book about, because there's certain things about her character that I just really enjoyed reading. And I loved seeing her interactions with John Blackthorne as well, because in many ways they're so different, but in other ways there is actually things that pull them together, and I just love seeing that on the page. My second favourite character, and this has got to be a close tie to Mariko, is Yoshi Toranaga. So Toranaga is based on Tokugawa Ieyasu, and anybody who's watched my Musashi review or my African Samurai review will know that I've talked about Tokugawa before, but Tokugawa was basically one of the great unifiers of Japan. He was considered to be one of the smartest people at that time, very calculating, quite Machiavellian in a way, but also very honourable, and was able to get people to do things that many other people wouldn't be able to. He was, you know, he's one of those people that really brought people together to like do a mission and get that mission done. And I love those types of characters, and I'm very interested in Tokugawa as a real life person as well. I've been reading quite a bit about him over the last few months. So to see it in Toranaga was really nice, because I got these Easter eggs in a way. And I just love seeing his strength as well, but his strength is also not only his physical strength, but also his intellectual strength, and the way his mind works and how calculating and smart and intelligent he is with the way that he moves the chess pieces on the board. I love the smart, intelligent character type. I love it. It's my favourite character type to read, and I think Toranaga is done really well in that way. There were some other really cool Easter eggs that I liked character-wise. So Goroda was based on Oda Nobunaga, which also considered to be one of the great unifiers of Japan as well. We also had Nakamura, who was based on Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was also another one of the great unifiers of Japan. Those three, Hideyoshi, Nobunaga, and Ieyasu, were considered to be the three great unifiers of Japan. So we get those other Easter eggs of the other great leaders of Japan as well, and I think it was done really well. I think it's also great that somebody who, I would say I know tons about Japanese history and culture. I'd say I probably know quite a bit about that period of history now. It's quite nice to be able to get those Easter eggs, but then also if you don't know anything about Japanese history, you're not going to miss out either. So it's quite nice to have it for both groups of people, those who know a little bit or a lot, and then those who know nothing. So I quite like the way that that was done. Now let's move on to thematic work. I think there's some really interesting threads in this book, and I think probably in the entire series. I know each book kind of focuses on a different area within parts of Asia. There was this constant struggle for peace in Japan amongst civil conflict. There was a lot of civil conflict in Japan at that time between the emperor, between samurai and their place in the world, and then everybody else underneath that. Japan has a really interesting sense of hierarchy in their culture, which is still prevalent today. And you definitely see that in the way that conflict was managed as well. So that was really interesting. There was also some pretty good religious exploration around the tension between Protestantism and Catholicism, and then also Buddhism. You know, some of the daimyos, who are basically feudal lords, would subscribe to Protestant beliefs. Others would be very anti-Christianity in general. And you just get a sense of like why people were siding with certain groups, religious groups, and how that ultimately led some to be very successful and also others to not be. So it's very interesting to see that play out. There's also this very big theme. I would say this is probably one of the most central themes of this book, is this clash between East meets West, and about how in this book, at least at the start, Japanese society is shown as being very insular and backwards. But then there is also an acknowledgement and an acceptance that there is merit in the way that the Japanese do things, and their focus and dedication to craftsmanship and strategy, and doing a good job well done. And I thought that was really nice to read. Like, I don't think this is like propaganda that's anti-Japan. Quite the opposite, actually. Like, it's very much looking it through the lens of an Englishman who's never experienced that part of the world. But then it's also about how that part of the world and how that culture can actually be very influential and important in living one's life, perhaps in a very different way, but nevertheless in a way that can be equally, if not sometimes more effective to one's personal and professional goals. There was also some exploration of the role of women, and this, I was kind of torn about how this was done. On the one hand, I really liked it because there was this whole exploration around how women can be samurai, but not samurai in the sense that they go out into battle and fight with a katana, like not that type of samurai. They are a samurai, but they're the samurai who is at home managing the household, managing the finances, managing the family, and planning for the future. And that's not to say that one is better than the other, it's that they're both equal, they're just different. And I did really like that message. But that being said, I did also find that some of the female characters felt like caricatures, and how some of the women were treated really badly, which obviously happens in any culture, but then it seemed at odds with the sense that I just mentioned. And I think that in itself is quite interesting, but at the same time, it also felt a bit inauthentic. So that's why I feel a little bit mixed about it. But I think overall, it did a good enough job to give a sense of the women's role in Japanese culture and society at that time. I think it gives you enough of a flavour that you're like, okay, I kind of get where this is going. So that's it on thematic work. Now let's move on to what I didn't like about this book. And there were a few things that I didn't like about this book. So the first thing is the world building. I don't think there was any world building in this book, barely any world building. It felt a bit lackluster, to be honest, and I would have expected more from a historical epic. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I read Musashi, and there is so much world building in that book. Some might even say too much, but I think it made it really enrich the world, and it made me really have like a good sense of these different cities and towns that Musashi is traveling to. And we just don't really get that here. I felt like we could have just had a layer deeper. You know, we're in a number of places like Mishima to Osaka to Edo to Yokohama, but we don't get any distinction between these places in terms of the world building. They all feel the same, but they are all distinct places. Like Edo, as an example, is modern day Tokyo. It would have been cool to get a sense of the early Tokyo being built, which you do get in Musashi, but we just didn't really get in this book. And I just would have liked a lot more, so that each place felt distinct and it added an extra layer of flavour to the story. The other thing I didn't really like was some of the cultural inaccuracies. I think this book is good for a certain type of reader, which is people who don't necessarily have tons of experience or knowledge about Japanese culture, and who don't particularly care about knowing tons about Japanese culture. Like, I think it gives you enough of a flavour, like things around like discipline and, like I said, about craftsmanship and things like that. Like, those are definitely a big part of Japanese culture even today. But there are some things that I think the author took liberties with. So one example of that is the concept of seppuku. Now, seppuku is a form of taking one's own life that was considered to be very honourable at that time. So, like, as an example, you might have done something that like shamed your family or yourself or your political faction, or, you know, whatever it may be. It doesn't really matter. Like a group of people that you're associated with. If that happened, one thing you could do is commit seppuku as a way of showcasing your honour and showcasing your apology to those other people. And what you would essentially do is you essentially disembowel yourself with a short sword. It was a form of ritualistic suicide, essentially, and it's very gory. If you've seen The Last Samurai, you will have seen a number of the samurai commit seppuku in the film. The concept of seppuku is not something that you do often. You know, it's not a decision that you make lightly. It's something that you do if you've made a really grave mistake, if you've really like done something really bad and you have a real deep sense of shame, then you commit seppuku. The problem with this book is every page someone is going to commit seppuku. And it kind of reduces the meaning of what this is about and what seppuku is really about. It's quite funny. Like I remember when I first started reading the book, I think it was maybe up to kind of like the 10-20% mark when we get introduced to the Japanese characters. I kid you not, like every page or every other page, seppuku was mentioned. And I was like, this is not how seppuku is meant to be used. In some instances, people use it almost like a threat. Again, you don't use it in that way. You know, you use it to showcase your honor if you've deeply shamed or done something to yourself or your a group of people that you're representing. You use it as a way to kind of atone for that shame. But here it's just thrown around so much that I just found it really funny. And Clavell has kind of maybe unintentionally made it into a bit of a joke when it's not. Like it's not something that you do lightly. It's a very serious thing that people do when it's like the gravest of thing that they've done. I think the cultural accuracy there could have been a bit better, especially because apparently James Clavell actually spent quite a lot of time in Japan. So I was a bit shocked about that, to be honest. I do think it does raise a general question mark around the overall accuracy over some aspects of Japanese culture. So that is something to keep in mind. And then this brings me on to my last issue, which was the language accuracy. Take my perspective on this with a pinch of salt. I've been learning Japanese now for about 9 months, and it's an absolutely incredible language. It's so different to English and Latin-based languages. Everything you know about language as an English-speaking person, as a native English-speaking person, and then learning Japanese, you just have to like basically just learn from scratch. Like there is nothing from the English language that you can take to help you learn Japanese. There's just no similarity whatsoever between them. Like you couldn't pick two more different languages, like genuinely. And so we get some mention of Japanese words, Japanese phrases in this book. And I think that's fine. Like, I think great. Like if you want to make it more historically accurate or whatever. The issue that I had, or at least in the edition of the book that I had, is when the characters speak Japanese, the way it's written in the book is using romaji. Now, romaji is basically like the English version of Japanese that helps people sometimes learn like the pronunciation of certain words. A lot of Japanese tutors actually say that when you're learning Japanese, you should not read romaji because that's not the actual language. It's just an English version to help people to maybe get a sense of how certain words are said. But like ideally you should learn by the Japanese alphabet, right? I don't look at it, and I've not been learning with romaji. I've been learning with the other 3 alphabets that you have to learn when you learn a language like Japanese. But the romaji in the book, I have seen a lot of romaji, even though I don't read it. And the romaji was just off. Specifically the spellings, I think a lot of them were actually wrong. But then the reason why I say take this with a pinch of salt is that maybe romaji has evolved in the last couple of decades. And that's why when Clavell was writing the romaji, it was different. I don't know. Like, I don't know enough to be super educated on the origins of romaji and how it's evolved over time because I don't read it. The book has very basic Japanese. So it's all the Japanese in this book was Japanese that I already knew. So I knew then that, okay, this word, I know what this word should be in romaji, and yet it didn't add up to what it should be based on actual Japanese alphabets, if that makes sense. Yeah, that was also just like the language accuracy coupled with the cultural inaccuracy, with the lack of world building. I felt like there was a big piece missing, and I think it was just that extra bit of detail, that extra layer of something more that would have really solidified this world in my mind that we were missing. And that was probably my biggest issue with the book. So I gave this book overall a 4 stars. I think it's a really solid book. I think it's very overhyped though. I think a lot of people have been reading this book over the last year or 2, which I think is great. But every single review has been like 5 stars, amazing, perfect. And I think that's great. But I think if you have some sense of Japanese culture and language and history, I don't know if you're necessarily going to love it as much. And that's not to like look down on people who don't have that knowledge, by the way. I don't want that to come across as like, oh, they don't know, so how can they know any better? Like, that's not why I'm saying it. I'm just saying that I think this is a good book for people who don't know anything about Japanese history, culture, and language. As an example, one of my friends was buddy reading it with me. Shout out to Io. He knows nothing about Japanese history, culture, and language. And he loved it. Like, he really loved it. And it was only after at the end when I finished as well, I told him my issues with the book, and he was like, yeah, well, I wouldn't know any of that just because I don't know anything about these topics. And I was like, yeah. So I think if you are somebody who's interested in these things, but you have no knowledge, I think you will probably enjoy it more just because you're going to look at it less critically. Whereas if you are somebody who has experience with the language, with the culture, and you know a little bit, even just a little bit about the history, you're going to be naturally more critical about it, especially when a lot of people say this is extremely historically accurate, which historically it might be, but at least culturally and language-wise, it's not the most accurate that I've ever read. I think if you want to get a sense of those things, you should read Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa, who was actually Japanese, and give you an even better sense of what Japanese culture, history and language is really about. I think it's a historical epic that everybody should read. I think even if you have experience in those things, you should still read it. Like, I think it's a well-written book, but I do think it's one of those books that if you're coming into it with zero knowledge or experience of these things, you're going to love it a lot more, and that's fair enough. I liked it. I'm definitely going to read more James Clavell. I have, I think, some of his other books on ebook, and I'm really excited to definitely delve into those because those are about things that I just don't really know much about. So I think I'll be a little bit less critical in that regard. Let me know down below if you have read it. Let me know what you liked, what you disliked, if you've read the later books, and I will see you there. Thanks for watching, Rogues. Please give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.